Looking at chapter 11. And I guess let me do this real quick one more time. Maybe not. Okay. Chapter 10, we talked about some of the changes and some of the things that were going on between the 900s and 1300. We kind of sort of ended in 1291 with the fall of Acre and the ending of the Last Crusade. And so now we move on, okay, into the 1300s, and the world situation doesn't get much better, I guess, but that's the joys of history. Around the 1300s, we get the beginnings of what is referred to as the Black Death. It is actually the bubonic plague, okay? The bubonic plague begins in Asia, all right, and eventually spreads from the Far East into Europe. By the time it ran its course, and we're talking about dozens of years here, we're not like just, and we're talking about worldwide, not just in Asia or Europe or Africa, okay? And we don't have, you guys can see Santos has a huge variation there. Anywhere from 25 to 65% of the world population had been decimated, okay? Since nobody kept track of how many people actually lived, and then how many people ended up dying from this, that's our best guess as to how many people died by the time the plague had made its way through. In addition, all right, so to make things worse, all right, number one, there's this, plague that's spreading pretty quickly amongst humans, starting around 1310. And obviously they didn't know because they're not like looking at their own weather, but looking back, we can see that it happened. A worldwide cooling trend began. What we only refer to as a mini ice age. In this case, summers were shorter, winters were longer and colder. I suppose if you just want to imagine, look outside, all right, it was cloudy, it was gross, and in this case, because of the cooling temperatures, harvests get ruined because certain plants need X amount of warm days to be able to fully mature. And so harvests were smaller. Smaller harvests means less food. Less food means people starve to death. All right? So those that do survive the plague are now faced with starvation. Okay? So it's kind of like a 1-2 punch to humanity. So it doesn't take very long. Within 5 to 7 years, we see a famine throughout, different parts of the world is taking place. Okay, punch number 3 now. Okay, in Asia, we enter a period of drought. So not only is it colder, it's drier. There's less rain, there's less snow. Okay, and so typically when there's a drought, people will migrate, people will move, looking for areas with rain, with better crops. And so, unfortunately, because the plague started in Asia, the people that begin to migrate are already infected. So we see the spread much quicker. All right. Now, just as an FYI, a lot of students think, oh yeah, it's rats that spread the bubonic plague. No, it is a very specific type of flea that lives on the rat that spreads the plague, okay? And if you've ever been around like cats or dogs that have fleas and you're like, oh, damn it, gotta take it to the vet. You know how quickly, those fleas can jump from an animal to a person, and all of a sudden you're scratching. I already see some of you doing that. Yeah, sorry, don't mean to bring up, bad memories here. But, you start scratching, and basically, victims died really quickly because it affected your lungs. So within a few days, you're coughing up blood, all right? But the reason why it was called the Black Death is because you start to form these sores from all the scratching, And then those sores turn dark. Your flesh literally dies on you. And so you've got this blood and black pus just coming out. I know, sorry about that. And some of you just had breakfast. Coming out of those infected areas. All right. And because, like I said, those of you that have had dogs or cats, you know how quickly fleas can spread. Because it spreads so quickly, in addition, you've got malnutrition and you've got people who are infected migrating. Okay? All right? It is spreading quickly. All right? Our first recorded outbreak of the bubonic plague occurs in the 1320s in China. That's where we see the first big one. Okay? By 1347, so within 20 years, we see it appearing in Italy. Okay? So it goes from China to Italy within a space of 20 years. Okay? Now, for that to happen, we can only assume, okay, that the rats, I guess, followed those trading routes. Maybe they snuck into the various harvests. They snuck into the loads of things that people were taking. But it is highly likely, because we know that this happened for hundreds of years, more than likely those rats got on board the ships. Because remember, one of the advances between the 900s and the 1300s was better ships, better boats, and they're taking supplies from the east to Europe. More than likely, those rats got onto those ships, infected not only the cargo, but very likely infected the crew. And of course, then guys get out there in Italy, they go off and they wander, and then they spread it to other people. The rats get off the boats, and they leave their fleas everywhere, and those then begin to infect the people in Italy. Okay. The Chinese population, which had been growing immensely, even back then, they had a huge population. Obviously, the plague halted that for a while. And even though at the end of the last chapter we talked about how the various things that brought the Mongols to a stop, they were great at conquering, but not very good at governing. Their enemies kind of banded together and were able to rise up against the Mongols. One of the other things that, of course, stopped them was the plague. If their soldiers are carrying the disease, and if the soldiers are weakened and dying from the plague, then of course their enemies are able to defeat them all that much quicker. Okay? By 1347, like I said, it had reached Italy, but it had already reached many of the Middle Eastern cities like Baghdad and places in Egypt and whatnot. In those places, they were already reporting thousands and thousands of deaths per day from the plague. And so those kingdoms that had set up, that had defeated the Crusaders, obviously could not defeat the plague. All right, very difficult, especially since they actually didn't know how it was transmitted. So it's not like they're going out there and killing rats and whatnot. And so basically, with the death of so many people, it leads to not only political collapse, but also economic ruin. All right? And then, of course, add to this, and while the mini ice age didn't quite affect places like Iraq and Syria and Egypt as much, the drought, okay, less water, that is affecting them quite a bit. Okay? And so we see just, society collapsing a little bit faster. All right. Of course, you got Santos, you got maps. This map then shows the thick lines are how it spread, or how the bubonic plague spread, or at least what we've been able to gather from records of, oh yeah, we were fine, and then all of a sudden 1,000 people died, in this area. And you notice how it just randomly appears on the Arabian Peninsula, where from there we extrapolate that, yeah, it was the ships, that were traveling that, once they landed, infected people got out and infected other people, or the fleas or the rats got off the boat and then began to make their way through different areas. Okay, so that within 20 years from the first outbreak in China, we see it in Italy. Okay, so that's a pretty fast spread. All right, considering the times. Okay, all right. So looking then at the effects it has on Europe. All right. In the places that I have listed there, Italy, France, the Netherlands, Germany, England, people had started to move into cities, okay? And unfortunately, no offense, my Euro-American friends, European cities in the Middle Ages were not the most sanitary places on the planet, okay? Whereas in the Americas, amongst the Toltec and eventually the Aztec and the Inca, and in other places amongst the various Muslim kingdoms, amongst the Persians, amongst Egyptians, they had already developed a very primitive system of running water and moving waste from one area to another. In these European cities, people were still doing their business in a bucket and then throwing it out the window into the street. Okay, and just FYI, that's where you get the tradition of ladies and gentlemen. If a gentleman is walking with a lady down the street, gentlemen are always supposed to walk on the outer part. Okay, and people think it's like, oh, in case like a car goes out of control and it hits the guy first and not the girl. No, you're both dead. Okay, in that regard. I mean, he just gets more dead than you. But it started because when people were throwing their, pardon my Spanish, their shit and their piss from the bucket out the window, they did this, and it looped out so that supposedly, oh, perfect, here. So supposedly it would miss the girl and hit the guy, okay? Because you were the gentleman, all right? You were going to take all the shit for her, all right? So, I mean, some of it might splash on her, all right? But you would get the bulk of it. But yes, the cities were crowded. The cities were unsanitary. And guess what rats love? Yes, they love filth. All right. Any of you have ridden the New York City subway system? Yeah. You guys were laughing. I've seen rats waiting for the queue. I'm just standing there. It's like, oh look, there's a rat going through the subway. All right. So yeah. Okay. Now. Out in the, you're like, it's true, man. And they're huge too. They're not like baby rats. Yeah. These are like, monster rats.
Well-fed rats.
Now, in order to avoid this, some people went to the countryside because obviously the further apart you are from people and society, then the less likely you are exposed to it. But I mean, it was only like a temporary thing because you still have to encounter other people, to buy food, to trade goods and whatnot. It is estimated, and so starting from when the first outbreak arrived in Italy until 1351, 50 million people died. And that's only like, holy shit, that's like 12, 13 years, 4 years. I cannot do math. Someone do the math for me. 4 years, okay. 5 years, whatever it is. I mean, people are people are kind of freaked out a little bit about COVID. It's been, and not to make light of it, it's been about 2 million people in the last, 2.5 years that we've been looking at it. Imagine 50 million, okay, dying in that same amount of time, okay? That is how fast and that is how deadly this plague was, okay? Now, the only good news, the only silver lining is that once all these people die, then it's kind of over, okay? Because there's nobody left to kill, all right? But, it wasn't completely eliminated. Every 7 years or so, you'd see an uptick as the human population would begin to grow a little bit, and unfortunately, humanity didn't really learn their lesson. It took them like hundreds of years to figure out that it was rats. It was the fleas on rats, so let's get rid of the environment that rats live in. Let's get rid of that particular rat. Let's, be cleaner and not dump, poop and pee in the street, and, maybe we'll cut back on this. So every couple years it would surge, but by 1450, within 100 years, it's estimated that there was less than 25% and here we're talking specifically about Europe, because Europe was the one that was decimated the most. Less than 25% of the European population was left once the plague made its way through, okay? And people are like, so then who survived? And this is kind of a lesson we can take even to today. There's a couple of you in here who are, pardon my language, genetic mutants. Your immune system would adapt to pretty much anything. And then there's the other spectrum of y'all who would die with any kind of bug. Like, you'd die from a cold if it were possible. Carol's like, that's me, okay? You catch everything that and you're like, yeah, that's me too. I'm allergic to like half the things in this room. People like that. But then everybody else, the other 80%, vaccines haven't been invented yet. With good health and vaccines and whatnot, would probably survive. Probably, I say, because even then it's not a guarantee. But the people that do survive are those genetic freaks that, you could infect them with anything, and they probably, their immune system adapts and they continue living, okay? Now, when stuff like this happens, and we've kind of seen it today, all right? Some people turn to debauchery, okay? What do I mean by that? What's the point? We're all gonna die, okay? I just watched my entire family die with like black pus coming out of their arms and throwing out blood. I'm just gonna go out and party and get drunk and do all the crazy shit because I'd rather die like, bungee jumping than in bed, coughing up a lung, okay? And I actually know people that took up skydiving and did kinds of stuff like that, or would just get like, drunk every weekend. So what? Either COVID gets me or my liver does, all right? Yeah, Liliana's like, yeah, true. With alcohol, at least I'm having fun, all right? And then, of course, other people became more religious. All right, I won't go into that too much, but I have met people that found God and began to pray more and do all this other stuff. Okay, a lot of people though during this time blamed the church. Okay, we've been giving you money, we've been praying, we've been doing everything that we're supposed to do, and yet where's God? Where's God to stop this? All right, from killing people, okay? And now, this is just kind of like worldwide, all right? Just kind of like a final look at the plague. In China, all right, during the bubonic plague, in 1200, there was 115 million people, we estimate, okay? By 1400, so 200 years later, there was a little under 75 million. All right, so they truly lost millions upon millions of people, okay? And of course, some of those people were farmers, and it didn't matter whether you were in China, in Persia, in Europe, in Africa. A farmer dies, less food, okay? Less food, society begins to die, all right? We see famine, all right? Along, like I said, with everything that we talked about, this is another contributor to the Mongols dying, or not dying, but collapsing. Because once again, if your soldiers are dying, all right, you're not winning battles. Okay, we just talked about this. In some areas, specifically Europe, the resultant population was less than 20% from pre-plague numbers. Now, in other areas, especially areas in Central Asia that were isolated, okay, it was more like maybe they lost 20%, 25%, 30%. But I mean, that's still a lot, okay? But in other areas that were more crowded and dirtier, less than 20% of the population lived. Now, one of the good things that comes out of all of this is starting in 1300 or 1400, depending on, when the plague finally made its way through, we begin to see new ideas take hold amongst people because we have less people now, all right? So everything has to be restructured. And in a lot of areas, okay, like we saw in Persia and amongst some of the Muslim kingdoms, the government collapsed. And so we need to see a rise in new governments, okay, that take their place. Because, you no longer have the same system, but you no longer have enough people to run the system the way you did before. Okay? Now, one of the things that comes out of this, all right, the Chinese had been doing it for thousands of years. Okay? It's known as the dynastic system or the system of dynasties. All right? A dynasty is a family ruling. Okay? And so you start with, okay, the first person within a family that begins to rule over an area. And then that rule passes on to other members of the family. Okay? Now, typically, all right, it is the eldest son, but not always. Okay? But it all stays within the same family, going down various generations. Okay? Now, obviously, because it's occurring in different places, there are different names for it. The Chinese called it the mandate of heaven. Basically, it is the universe, let's say, or whatever higher power that chose this family, okay, chose the Marcuses, okay, to rule over China, all right? And the other members of this family, okay, continue with that mandate until a new family rises up and takes over. Okay? In Europe, they didn't call it the mandate of heaven, but it became known as divine right. Okay? Because it was God that chose your family to rule. And specifically, it was God, and I'll just go with another Marcus, who chose Marcus to be king. All right? Now, how do you get to be king, first off? Are you voted for? We're literally just watching this right now happen in England. All right? Did anybody vote for Charles? No. Okay. How did he get to be king?
His mother was queen.
His mom died, and who was he?
Prince of Wales.
The first in line. He was the oldest son. Okay? Now, the concept of divine right says that the reason why Charles was first in line, the reason why Charles is the next king, is because that's what God wanted. If God did not want Charles to be the next king, Charles would have died as a baby, or Charles would have never been born, or Queen Elizabeth would never have become queen when her father died, and her father only became king because his brother gave up the throne because he married Wallace Sampson, a divorced American woman, and people were all up against it back then. If you've ever watched The Crown, you know what I'm talking about. All right? Or read Wikipedia. Okay? And so people are like, okay, that's the reason why Marcus is king, because this is what God wanted. All right? If God didn't want that, we would have had these other circumstances happen to keep him from being king. Okay? And we'll talk about this in a minute. Okay? or go deeper into it. Amongst the Ottomans, the concept with the Ottomans, they called it carrying the banner of Islam. Okay, kind of the same thing, that whoever ruled over the Ottomans was chosen to be this example of Islam, this model example. Okay, now, obviously, okay, they establish these rules for succession. We've already talked about that. Typically, the eldest son, all right, becomes king. England is actually one of the few exceptions where if there are no sons born, then a woman can inherit the throne. Hence why Queen Elizabeth was queen for 70 years, all right? But typically it'll be the eldest son. In some of the Muslim kingdoms, not all of them, but in some, the previous ruler would designate who was going to follow him, or there was a council vote. If that ruler, if he was like king, but he never got around to designating his heir. Okay, now, we've got these little kingdoms. Remember, not a whole lot of people left on the planet, and especially in Europe, less than 20%. Okay, so how are we going to make these kingdoms bigger? Okay, well, number one, the most obvious way is physical conquest. All right, get your soldiers together and let's move into Marcus Land and conquer Marcus Land, and now it's part of our kingdom. Okay, but remember, all right, don't have a lot of people. All right, especially in those first couple dozen years. We need the population to kind of catch up and maybe avoid that 7-year cycle of, oh, hey, we're getting too big and we're throwing garbage in the street again and the rats are coming back, all right, and the plague has its little mini surges, okay? And so what they begin to do, and once again, this is Euro specific, but it does happen in some other areas, we begin to see that members of royal families begin to marry other royal families. Okay, so you have King Santos, okay, who has a son, and I want to say Hunter. We have King Hunter, who has a daughter, and so in order to bring our kingdoms together, my son marries his daughter, and so then once both he and I die, then the two kingdoms come together under our son and daughter, well, basically the son, rule, okay? But now, okay, this kingdom has just doubled in size, okay? And so this is why most of the European royal families, even up until today, they're basically cousins, all right? Everybody's like related to everyone else. And for the longest time, especially in the 1800s, like cousins married cousins, okay? I know you guys are making gross faces, but back then they considered that acceptable to keep power within the same families. Okay, you're not going to let some random person. Sorry, you can be the random. Okay, you can be Meghan Markle. You're not going to let Meghan, marry into the family and bring in different blood. Okay. What's interesting is that even Kate Middleton, she's not a royal. They were allowed to marry like just normal average people. But back in the day, Charles wasn't. He had to marry Princess Diana, even though he was in love with Camilla. And even after he married Diana, he still kept Camilla as a side piece. I actually saw a meme this morning. It's like, ladies, from side piece to queen. Like you follow your dreams. Like some of you are like, yeah. She kept at it. She didn't leave Charles alone even after he got married. So yeah. But back then, yes, that was it. You married other royals. Okay. In fact, Queen Elizabeth and her husband, Prince Philip died last year. They were third cousins. They were cousins. All right, so it's like, ew, but it's third cousins, so it's low down enough on the ladder. So, and you're like, no, ew, I'm never, no, I don't care. Third cousin, fifth cousin, 20th cousin, no. But like, their babies weren't mutants. Well, I don't know. You guys are like, Santos, Charles, that weird head. I don't know. Yeah, okay. Okay, and we'll actually talk about it here. The Habsburgs, the royal family of Austria.
Yep, the chin.
Yes, the chin. They called it the Habsburg chin. They had intermarried for hundreds of years. That they were all born with like this deformed chin. Because they hadn't allowed any other blood into the family, type of thing. So it was just like, ew. Okay. Looking at the Islamic kingdoms before I get too distracted by these royal families. The Mongols destroyed Baghdad. Okay, remember they took the emir, they wrapped him in a carpet, and then they ran him over with horses. All right. Even after that happens, the plague arrives, okay, and completely kills people, kills rulers, decimates the area. And so basically what happens, once the area recovers, the Mongols are beaten back by the Egyptians, by other tribes, and of course by the plague. The societies had basically collapsed, and so what emerges in this area, there are three major Islamic kingdoms. Okay, that's not to say there aren't other groups, but there's three big ones. Number one is the Ottomans. Okay, now the Ottomans are another tribe of Turks. Okay, the ones that had originally taken over were the Seljuk Turks. They were basically decimated by the Mongols and then later by the plague. Okay, so the ones that are left are the Ottomans, and that's why I put they're Turkish. They speak Turkish, they have Turkish traditions. They become one of the major powers. Okay, the Safavids, which are Persian, okay, they're one of the many Persian tribes. They're the ones that take power. Okay, and then finally in India, because don't forget you had Indians ruling you had Muslims ruling over India during this time. The Mughals, okay, they're the ones that come to power. They're a slightly different tribe, because remember, it was the Turks that invaded India. They still collapsed in India, okay? So it's the Mughals that take over, and they're the dominant Muslim tribe in India, okay? And so we'll talk about the Ottomans, because they actually become the most powerful one in the area, okay? Like I said, the Seljuk Turks took over, okay? Then come the Mongols, and the Mongols defeated the Seljuk Turks, okay? And of course, the plague then eliminates the rest of the Seljuks. Well, the Ottomans, okay, they're a minor Turkish tribe, but thanks to the Mongols and the plague, they end up being the dominant one, okay? They're probably, filled with genetic mutants that were able to resist the plague, okay? And so they take control, okay? And even though predominantly they are nomadic, they come to take over then the entire area, all right? Their first chief, known as Osman, okay, establishes the Ottomans as the major tribe, okay, in the area, okay? Now, Osman is from a branch of Islam known as Sunni. There are two major ones, Sunni and Shiite, and they kind of compete with each other, okay? Kind of like, in this case, the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox. There are two divisions of the same religion, because, once again, they have lost a lot of warriors to the Mongols and, of course, the plague, okay? The Ottomans turned to negotiation to bring people into the kingdom, specifically negotiating with the Shiites, okay, number one, because they are their biggest competition. And they basically say, we can't continue being opposites, especially when there's so few of us left. Once he establishes this relationship with Shiites, he then negotiates with the Sufis, okay? Remember, the Sufis are also Muslim, but they are more spiritual. Okay, they don't quite, they're more the missionary type. Okay, and then finally, because the Byzantines are still there, they haven't quite conquered them yet. Spoiler alert. They negotiate with the Byzantines a peace treaty. Okay, and so because of this, all right, there are lots of groups that willingly join the Ottomans. They're like, okay, we can tell you're not just going to come in and slaughter us. You're not going to take over us, violently. You're willing to negotiate. Well, we'd like to negotiate being accepted by your kingdom. Okay? And so, the Ottomans initially grow their kingdom and their influence this way by accepting people. Okay? And in many cases, they would not only accept people and have them bring their own traditions along, but the Ottomans adopted some of the traditions and customs of the people that joined the empire willingly. Okay, now they're still big on Sunni Islam. Okay, they're still Sunni. They're not giving up on that, but they are accepting, other ideas and other customs, and making them a part of their beliefs. Okay. Now, remember that in history, when we talk about the 14th century, the 15th century, just subtract 100 years. Okay. So in the 14th century, mid-14th century, which means about 1350s, okay, the Ottomans do begin then to go out and conquer some people and take over some people, and they turn north and they take over the Balkans, okay? The Balkans are an area of southeastern Europe, modern-day Greece, and Bulgaria, and Serbia, and Bosnia, and Croatia, okay, those areas. And if you've ever wondered why Bosnians are, in fact, Muslim, it is because they were taken over by the Ottomans, and they basically converted to Islam while they were a part of the Ottoman Empire, okay? By the 16th century, or the 1500s, this is why I said the Ottomans eventually become the most powerful and the most influential of the Islamic kingdoms. They controlled everything from Morocco, which is the furthest western tip of North Africa, all the way into Europe. They actually made it to the gates of Vienna, all right, in Austria, before they were finally pushed back, before the Europeans were able to mount some kind of defense. But for hundreds of years, the Ottomans did control southeastern Europe, okay? In the east, they were able to make it all the way to Persia, conquered everything to Persia, but the Safavids were able to stop them, all right? And plus, they were other Muslims, so, okay, we'll leave you guys alone, all right? And after that, they turned south, and they actually conquer most of what today would be Saudi Arabia, or just Arabia. They kept out of like the really harsh deserts, but they conquered a lot of the land along the coasts. Okay, so they become, like I said, the biggest kingdom in that area. Their leader, okay, became known as the Sultan. All right. If you want to say king, if you want to say emperor, that's fine. All right, but his proper title is the Sultan. He was both the government and the military leader, and so as the population is replenishing, as the Ottomans are continuing to grow and conquer, all right, more and more people are being asked to pledge their loyalty and pledge their allegiance to the Sultan. Okay, those people that were conquered, that were taken over, didn't matter, all right, who you were or your background. As long as you pledged your loyalty to the Sultan, they were rewarded not only with money, but also with favored status in the government, all right? You were allowed to be a part of the ruling class, all right? About 5 minutes. So here's the map, of course, always a map with Santos. The dark brown, okay, is what the original Ottoman Empire is, or this brown, not this. This is still the Byzantines. Don't worry, they'll be over in a second. But then they conquered this, all right, in the early 1500s. They conquer this in the later 1500s, all right. They're stopped by the Persians. Eventually, like I said, they make it all the way to Vienna before they are stopped. But basically, most of what today we call the Middle East was a part of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, I think there's 2 more slides. Okay, this you don't need so much other than this date. One of the Ottoman sultans, known as Mehmed, okay, he is the one who, on May 29th, 1453, like I said, this is the only part you really need, the city of Constantinople is conquered. It is taken over after 53 days of siege. Once they take it over, it is renamed Istanbul. All right, so you won't find Constantinople on a map anymore. It is the modern-day city of Istanbul. Basically, by this point in time, thanks to hundreds of years of military defeat, thanks to the plague, thanks to famine, there's only about 7,000 people left in the city, but they are still able to hold off almost 70,000 Ottoman warriors before they finally surrender. Okay, now this is just my own editorial here. This marks the final end of the Byzantine Empire. Some people say, some historians say, and I would tend to agree, this is the final end of the Roman Empire. Because remember, the Roman Empire split into the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, and the Byzantines are basically what was left over of the Romans. Okay, and so now all of this, okay, the most important city here, all of this now is part of the Ottomans. Okay, everything that they've taken over. All right, so what's the only date? May 29th, what year? 1453. Okay, now, oops, I am going the wrong way. Okay. Let me skip to this one. Okay. One of the things about the Ottomans, all right, is that they actually last until the 20th century. The Ottoman Empire only collapsed about 100 years ago, and the only reason that happened is because of World War I. They joined Germany. I know they made a mistake on that one. Okay, they sided with Germany, and Germany lost, and so the Ottoman Empire was broken up. Okay, but otherwise, all right, they lasted for several hundred years. Okay, and one of the reasons, okay, is because they did allow diversity amongst the various people that they took over. Okay, remember, they took over Turkey, they took over parts of Europe, they took over Egypt, they took over North Africa. All of those areas are different culturally and language-wise, and I mean, they may share the same religion, but there's still differences amongst them. And so the Ottoman Empire actually became a very multilingual and multicultural kingdom. Okay, as far as languages go, if you wanted to be a part of the government, if you wanted to serve the Sultan, you spoke Turkish. You had to learn Turkish. Okay, in order to be a good Muslim, you had to speak Arabic because all of the religious stuff was done in Arabic. And of course, the common people, the people that were conquered in Arabia and other parts, they spoke Arabic. Okay, in the European areas, Greece and Bosnia and Serbia, they were allowed to keep their own languages. They weren't forced to learn, any new languages. Although, if people wanted to, they could, especially if they wanted to be a part of the government, or in areas like Bosnia where people converted to Islam, then they learned Arabic. But otherwise, they were allowed to keep their European languages. Okay. In fact, one of the things that the Ottomans did, okay, is that many Europeans, and they were known as Janissaries, were conscripted, taught the Ottoman ways. They were taught Islam, and then they were sent out to administer the empire. So the Ottoman Empire was almost Europeanized, okay? Not completely, because obviously before you could do this, you had to convert to Islam and you had to learn Arabic. But, okay, we do see these people bringing in their own culture into it, okay? We're going to stop right here, all right? And when we come back on, what day is that? Wednesday. We will continue talking about the Western Europe. MK. I'm sorry? No, I'm going to look at the calendar. We need to push it back at least one day. If you walked in late, please come see me for attendance. Last name? No worries. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
It is interesting. It's all like a continuous stream of words. There's like punctuation and stuff that's very minimal. And I don't excess people that way.
Have a good day, Professor Santos.
Bye.
Class makes me wanna cry.
I said you're on the verge of tears the whole time.
Why? What is it?
Art appreciation.
Oh yeah.
I've never been so confused in my life.
I was like, I wanna get me on art for
Do you have Ayana?
I had her last year and I really liked her.
I don't know. I have the lady that comes in. I forget her Everything just cry.
Thank you.
I'll see you later. Yeah, I'll see you later.
I'll see you.
I'll see you.
How are you doing?
Good, how are you?
Pretty good. Yeah, just stand it up a little bit.
Should have turned this off.